Welcome back, everyone, to the Nick Bartlett Show. Today, joining me on the show is Jamey Vinnick, who is an award-winning beat writer for CougFan.com. Today, we'll talk about what to expect from Washington State on the field, how the Coug culture is holding up really in the midst of realignment, and the college football landscape in general. So thank you, Jamey, for coming on the show.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to do it and talk some Washington State.
Yeah, definitely. And as always, everyone, please remember to like and subscribe to our content on YouTube for Super West Sports. All right, guys, without further ado, let's just get to the question. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of maybe unusual question here. I felt Jake Dickert didn't do good enough last year, 5-7 overall with 3 consecutive losses to ASU, Stanford, and Cal. It just really didn't sit well with me. I get that he's well liked on campus and respected in the community and a stand-up guy, but is he really the right guy to lead the program right now?
Yeah, I think it is a question that does kind of have some legs in the Coug world. I think personally, right now for Washington State, it's more than just the on-field results. Is you need a guy to lead them into this unknown of not knowing where your conference future is. For the first time, basically ever, you're not in a power league. You are not considered a Power 5 school. I don't think there's a better guy for Washington State in that regard than Jake Dickert. I think the way that he has kind of really taken the forefront, being the guy kind of at the forefront of all of this. I mean, you think about that Washington State's athletic director has left. Their men's basketball coach has left. There's all this turnover, and he has kind of been that one. If you kind of look at those three as, kind of the three big athletic employees in terms of what sports draw the most, and then, of course, the guy in charge of all the sports and the AD, he's the one guy who has been here all throughout this past year. Obviously, Pat Shun going to Washington and Kyle Smith going to Stanford. So I think from that standpoint, and then just his personality and the way that he represents Washington State, I don't think there's a better guy in that sense to kind of be in a position of such magnitude at a time like this. As for the on-field results, I think last year was tricky because I think Jake would be the first to tell you it wasn't good enough from the players, from himself, from the rest of the coaching staff. 5-7 isn't acceptable. It wasn't okay. That said, I think there were a lot of things that went wrong in that season that maybe aren't in his control. I don't think he is responsible necessarily for the struggles of the offensive line. I think that goes back to some really poor recruiting classes before he got here. I mean, you look at the 2021 recruiting class, Nick Rolovich and Mark Weber take 2 offensive linemen. Well, that lack of depth hurts them. Now, granted, those 2 guys have become starters, Christian Hilborn and Brock Dew, but you go back to the 2020 class, even the 2019 class, and there were a lot of whiffs in there. But, even the Mike Leach and Mason Miller classes. Obviously, they've got guys like Connor Gomness out of there, Maki Fafita, Rod Tilavea, but there just wasn't a level of depth that there needed to be. So there's a lot of guys, especially last year, that they're kind of just trying to plug in and play, and with some mixed results. I think there were games that Cameron Ward could have won, that he had the opportunity to make the plays that made him such a highly touted quarterback and a Heisman candidate, whatever you want to call it, and it didn't happen. I mean, he had opportunities against Stanford, against UCLA, against Cal, against Washington. Those plays weren't made. And it's not necessarily always on Ward, but it's your job as a quarterback to do those kind of things. And then you look at the last 3 games. They lose to Washington, they lose to Stanford, they lose to Cal. Not their last 3 directly, I should say, but 3 of their last games. And their former all-conference place kicker goes 1 for 5. I mean, that's the real killer. Dean Janikowski, who was tremendous for Wazoo, really the last 2 years and even the first part of last year, goes into a bit of a slump, and they lose a bunch of games by 3 points. One or 2 of those kicks goes a different way. They're in a bowl game, and it's a much different season. And I think it's, looking at that team, I think it was more talented than the team 2 years ago, the one that did make a bowl. And I'd venture to say he was their most talented team since the Gardner Minshew season. The difference was you didn't have the Minshew magic, and you didn't have the level of execution. And that does fall on the coaches. And again, Dickert took full responsibility every single time that there was a loss. And, I know that season weighed hard on him. I mean, you look at him after the Apple Cup, and he was extremely emotional because he knew that the standard was not met. But I think that, he wasn't left with a ton when Rolovich, when that situation kind of took place basically after that season. almost everyone left. I mean, in terms of you lost a lot of guys, going from Delora to Borghi to a lot of players on defense. So it's kind of been a bit of a retool on the fly. And then I think Cam Ward doesn't quite become what you expect. He was good at Washington State. He wasn't the elite level quarterback that they wanted. So I think he's been dealt some bad hands. But that all said, there does come a time where you need to win some games. And I think this year's a big year in kind of determining what his future looks like. Not that he's on the hot seat. I wouldn't say anywhere near the hot seat right now. Just A, I think, as we said, it's been a small sample size. B, you're talking about Washington State's in a unique situation. They're not really in the place to be firing football coaches, especially prematurely. So, but I think in terms of public perception, this is a big season where he probably needs to win 8 games. And I think a lot of the questions will be answered in that way.
Yeah, no, and that's going back to kind of something you said, a little too late response by me here, but yeah, just having that stability with Pat Chun obviously leaving, going to rival, and then Kyle Smith obviously going to Stanford. So having stability in the program should definitely benefit the Cougs in some way. So now headed back to a little bit kind of more basic question. I had kind of written, who do you feel will win the quarterback battle between John Mateer and transfer Zevi Eckhouse, if I'm saying that right? But just what are your kind of 2 thoughts on these guys?
Yeah, I think they're very different. I think John is a little more of, again, kind of that, not comparing him to Gardner Minshew, but he has kind of that swagger, that aura about him, that he has the confidence that he can make every throw and the confidence that he can go win a ball game. I mean, we saw, I think his first or second practice of fall camp 2 years ago, he throws a ridiculous, off balance 55-yard touchdown. And this is an 18-year-old kid turns and taunts the defense and some of the seniors and everything. And it's, okay, like this is a little bit different than maybe what your standard quarterback had been. Maybe at that point what we knew Ward was. Whereas it's, okay, that's something maybe a Minshew would do, that kind of swagger. Now, he does have some turnover issues. We saw that a lot during the spring, that sometimes that confidence can bite him. He tries to make throws that aren't good or are not well-processed throws into traffic. He thinks he can make every throw, which you have to be able to believe that as a quarterback. It's a matter of, okay, can I make that throw, or is that a really dangerous throw to make? It got better throughout the spring. I think by the end of spring ball, he had cleaned a lot of that up. But I think ultimately he's the one who's going to give him the higher upside. Zevi Eckhouse probably gives him the higher floor. I think if they start Eckhouse, you can probably pencil him in for 6 wins. I think he's very seasoned. He's very mature, experienced guy. And he has the ability to make some plays too. I think Mateer's probably more the natural playmaker, but Eckhouse is plenty capable of doing so as well. I just don't know what the ceiling looks like with him. And I think part of that is, you've seen what he's capable of at the college level, granted at Bryant at a much smaller school, much lesser competition, but I think their ceiling raises with Mateer. I think their floor raises with Eckhouse. In my personal opinion, I do think Mateer is going to end up winning the job, but I also think I'm trying to find the best word. I also think that this is truly a battle. Sometimes coaching staffs will say, no, this is a competition until the very end. And it's like, okay, they're lying. They said it with Cam Ward in the past. Everyone knew Cam Ward was starting. This really is going to go down into the first couple of weeks of fall camp to a point where they say, okay, we have to make a decision. We've got to get our guy running with the ones offense consistently, get him acclimated to being QB1. So I don't think we have an answer yet. Again, if the season started tomorrow, I think it would be Mateer, but this is not some situation where if Eckhouse won the job, I'd be absolutely stunned. I think it is a very close competition and one we won't have an answer for, at least for another month.
Yeah, and the way I'm viewing the season, I'll touch on it, a little bit later on here. But to me, it sounds like I'd personally prefer Mateer. I think I'd like to see the Cougs put a little more risk into it, especially with the new schedule. 6 wins doesn't feel like. I'll touch on that later. So the next question I want to get to is when I looked at WCU's transfers in the offseason, I was shocked to see Chris Hudson from Oregon. Outside of Kyle Williams, do you think he could be the biggest playmaker on offense, or is there just someone I'm completely missing here?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting. I think a lot of people, myself included, expected Hudson to come in and he was going to be the starting slot receiver, no questions asked. Josh Meredith then broke out, and this was a 4th-year guy from Fresno. a guy that had just kind of been there for a little bit. There hadn't been a whole lot of talk about him. Honestly, a guy who I wasn't sure would still be on the team this year. And then he came through and had just an absolutely monster spring. I mean, looked like an absolute, phenom in the slot, sure-handed, great rapport with Mateer. So that kind of added some doubts of, okay, who's really going to be getting the big touches there? And I think it'll end up being split with those two. And then I think Tony Freeman, a JUCO transfer, will fit in as well. But I don't think Hudson is going to be just the absolute, Lincoln Victor go-to slot guy. I think it'll be a mixture of guys in that slot position, kind of trying to do what Victor did last year when he was healthy. And then on the outside, they'll have obviously Kyle Williams, who I think will be their leading receiver. But I think Carlos Hernandez could be in store for a really big year. Showed some ability last year, had over 200 yards, playing kind of as that sixth receiver. He's probably going to start on the outside. He's a guy who I think could end up having a really big year, kind of come out of maybe the woodwork a little bit and be that secondary option to Williams on the outside.
And then what was the original name you said, the transfer from Fresno State?
So Josh Meredith, he's not a transfer. He was a prep signee from the class of 2021 out of Fresno. And again, he was a guy that they flipped from Fresno State, actually. There's a lot of people who thought he could be a sleeper. We didn't really see it in 2021. Didn't see much in 2022. Again, there were some flashes last year. He played a little bit in kind of some mop-up roles, but it just kind of felt like, all right, this is a guy who, he's still on the roster. Again, when they kind of went through the portal process, I was mildly surprised that I didn't see his name in there. He even talked about that it was never a thought for him. He wanted to stick this out at Washington State. And then he gets some early reps in the slot during the spring and just really cemented himself as one of the top slot receivers. Now, there's obviously a difference between doing that in the spring and doing that in the regular season, but he certainly looked the part of a guy who could be kind of one of the breakout stars of this team. And again, a guy that most people, I think, had not maybe written off, but didn't exactly still think there was a whole lot left to build on. Clearly, they were building something with him. I think Nick Edwards has done a great job developing him as a slot receiver, and I think he's a guy that could be a really good safety net for either Mateer or Eckhouse.
Yeah, no, I had not heard that name. I've been doing a bunch of, doing some research, and I heard of Tony Freeman from College of San Mateo. You had Trey Shackelford, a transfer from Austin, PA. But yeah, had not heard that name. And then, so the next question going back to, and maybe because of the unusual circumstances around Pullman, and you could throw Corvallis in there right now. Obviously, we always love doing the football breakdown and talk, but the question I really want to ask right now, how's the WSU football culture? How's Pullman feeling? Are the fans more hurt kind of by the Pac-2 snub? Or are they more invigorated, fired up, ready to prove themselves?
Invigorated. That's the simple. I mean, Wazoo fans are, perpetually angry about something, and this just gives them more fuel to the fire. I mean, they're pissed. I think that the coaching staffs are upset. I think that the admin was upset. I think a lot of it was the frustration that the way these conferences were built weren't necessarily built off merit. I think you look at a Washington State, especially from the football side of things, you look at them, you look at a Colorado, you look at an Arizona, and it's, okay, Washington State's the one who gets left out. And obviously, those examples right now, Colorado has the Sanders hype machine behind it. Arizona's coming off a great year, but you look over the last decade, and those are kind of the bottom feeders of the Pac-12. Colorado made one Pac-12 title game, weak Pac-12 and got dusted by Washington. Arizona's had some decent years in there. Again, they were great last year. They had a couple good years with Khalil Tate, but I think for Washington State fans, from a football standpoint, you look at that and say, how was Washington State the team left out, whereas these teams were no-brainers? So I think there's frustration off that. As for the culture, I think it would have been very easy for the culture to fold. I think there was a lot of fear going into the offseason that there was going to be some kind of just mass exodus and that Washington State was going to lose everything. That didn't happen. They lost Cam Ward. I don't think it would have mattered where they were going. They could have stayed in the Pac-12. Cam Ward was probably going to leave anyways. I mean, I think he had his sights set on the NFL. Once that became once that was no longer an option, he turned his attention elsewhere. I don't think there was a scenario where Cam Ward was back. Maybe Josh Kelly stays if they stay in the Pac-12, but there was also, I think, an NIL dollar that Texas Tech hit that Washington State couldn't match. But I think you look at the rest of the roster, the other guys they lost, they were depth pieces. They were guys that the coaching staff, I don't want to say didn't care to lose or but weren't necessarily, stunned or shocked or taken aback by some of those departures. Guys like Javen Robinson, guys like Zion Nunley or Ryan Peters. These were guys that they said, okay, like, darn, what are we going to do? They did lose a lot to the draft. You look at Brennan Jackson, Ron Stone, Shaw Smith Wade, Jaden Hicks. They did get hit hard by the draft, but again, Ron Stone and Brennan Jackson weren't playing college football next year no matter what. They had exhausted all eligibility. I don't think there was a scenario where Shaw Smith Wade or Jaden Hicks was coming back next year. They had proven what they needed to prove. They were ready to go on to the next stage. Other guys they lost. Lincoln Victor was out of eligibility. Connor Gomnes just decided to retire. He was just done playing football. So, I think Ward and Kelly certainly are guys that hurt. And again, maybe in a different world, they're back if Washington State's still in the Pac-12 or gets moved into the Big 12. But I think for Wazoo to keep Kyle Williams and keep Buda Alupta and David Gusta and a lot of these kind of important players to their future, Christian Hilborn on the line, I think was a huge victory. And I think it speaks a lot to the culture that they just did not get decimated. In a world where it doesn't matter if you're Washington State or Alabama, guys are getting in the portal. I mean, we see Alabama lose key players every year. We just saw Washington come off a national title or national title appearance. Granted, there's a coaching change in there, but basically everyone that was coming back left. I mean, their entire offensive line, much of their secondary, receivers, defensive or linebackers, you name it, guys left. In Washington State, it didn't happen, and it wasn't for a lack of interest. I mean, I think there's a known factor that there isn't always, rule following when it comes to contacting players or trying to poach this guy or poach that guy. But and I think Washington State found a little NIL money too to keep guys around. But to bring back guys like Williams and Gusta and Alukta, who would have been really highly sought after in the portal, I think speaks a lot to the culture they've built that guys just didn't want to leave.
Yeah, and it's I guess I don't want to homer it too much, but yeah, it's cool to see that they were able to keep some players around for sure. And then so you actually kind of led me to my next two questions. So the first thing I wanted to kind of mention is you talked about players that, and this one might surprise people a little bit, but if you really watched, probably not. They lost Nakia Watson, and honestly, I just felt whether it was overuse at his previous stops or WSU or injuries, I just felt he didn't have it by the end of the year. Great when he first burst on the scene. So you're looking at him gone, and like you mentioned, WSU returning 4 offensive linemen and a couple key pieces. Do you think they'll be able to run the ball better this year? Is that even a priority?
I do think it is certainly a priority, and I think Coach Dickert said it all last year. We have to be able to run the ball, and they couldn't. I mean, and I think it will be better, partly because I don't know how much worse it could get. It was not good last year, and I think it was a mixture of Watson had some injuries. He wasn't overly effective when he was on the field. I don't think the offensive line was great in run protection. And I think teams kind of started to stack the box and say, let's make Cam Ward make some of these tough decisions. So there was a lot of things at hand. I tend to believe that the run game is going to be a lot better, though. I think they've got a very unique backfield right now where I don't know if there is going to be one pure starter. I think you've got Juvenski Schlenbaker, third-year guy from Bellingham. You've got Wayshawn Parker, a freshman from Sacramento. Dylan Payne, fifth-year walk-on from Olympia. And then you've got Leo Pululasi, a second-year guy from Tacoma. He got injured his leg during the spring game, but should be back by the time fall camp rolls around in a couple weeks. So you've got those 4 guys, and I think we'll see a very split backfield. I think we'll see guys in certain situations. Your downhill situations are just going to be a lot of Pululasi and a lot of Schlenbaker. They're kind of your bigger bruisers. Pass pro situations, that's going to be a lot. Excuse me, a lot of Dylan Payne. He's far and away their best pass blocker as a running back. And then I think in pass catching situations, it'll be a lot of Payne and Parker. And Parker's got some of that quickness to him, some of that, that twitch that coaches love, and made a few really nice plays in the spring game. And a guy who rushed for 2,000 yards in prep last year. So I think they certainly have some options at running back to where I don't think you're going to see a bell cow like you saw with Watson, like even you saw maybe to some degree with Max Borghi at times. Whereas, this year it's going to be really, I think, 4 guys who could all get 50 to 100 carries. And maybe that's overshooting it a little bit, but I don't think it's that outlandish to say that they're going to really split that up. And then I just think the continuity of the offensive line is huge. I mean, they bring back both tackle starters, both guard starters, and then you're breaking a new center with Devin Kalani, but he's a guy who's in his 5th year now. He was Gomez' backup. He was Brian Green's backup. This is a guy who's been around the system a long time. He's well equipped to knowing what he needs to do as a center. Then you've got Dew and Hilborn at guard, Famoa and Pole at tackle. So I just think based off that, and again, based off the fact that it couldn't get a lot worse than last year, I do think the run game is going to be much improved for Washington State.
Yeah, and obviously, having a wide variety of backs should help, particularly when, I mean, I was looking at the stats here. Nakia Watson only averaged 3.6 yards per carry and 4 touchdowns last year. And I know his total yards on the season weren't too much. I didn't want to throw it in because that would have just been a little too harsh. So, yeah, I personally think this could actually be maybe a unit that surprises a lot of people, particularly, like you mentioned, because of the offensive line. And then the last football question before kind of just getting the general housekeeping stuff to kind of end the show here. What should we expect out of WSU's defense this season? You actually already talked about it, losing both superstar ends in Ron Stone Jr. and Brendan Jackson. But they do return linebacker Kyle Thornton and nickelback. It's been a while since I've said this name, Kapina Gushigan. He made a huge play. Was it against Wisconsin with the pick six?
UCLA had an 80-yard pick six.
UCLA. So having those two guys should help. And then another name I've heard is Cyrus Webster. So just really with a lot of unknowns, what are just your general thoughts on the defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be different. I mean, you don't have Stone and Jackson, and that was, they predate Jake Dickert by multiple years. I mean, they had been, since Dickert became the defensive coordinator, had been his bread and butter at edge. I mean, it was as simple as you knew in January of last year and the year before that and the year before that who your starting edges were going to be. Whereas this year it's a battle. And they've got 6 guys kind of competing for those 2 spots with, as you mentioned, Cyrus Webster, the Utah Tech transfer, Quinn Roth, veteran, former walk-on from San Marcos, Andrew Edson, another veteran from Snoqualmie, both those guys in their last years. And then you've got Ray M. Stevenson, 4th-year guy from Texas, who you're kind of waiting for that breakout, which I think they're hoping is this year. Isaac Taro, a 2nd-year guy from Utah who has done a lot of good things in camp, kind of still waiting to see it on the field. And then Nusi Milani, a starting defensive tackle last year that they kicked to the outside, former Virginia transfer with a lot of speed and power in his pass rushing ability. So you've kind of got those 6 guys, plus, you never know what you're going to get out of freshmen. They've got 2 guys coming in, Camden DeGraw from Coeur d'Alene, Malachi Rice from McAllister, Oklahoma. So the edge position is going to be, I think, by committee. You're not going to ask anyone to be Brennan Jackson. You're not going to ask anyone to be Ron Stone Jr. You can get 3, 4, 5, 6 guys to contribute a couple sacks here and there. That's how you make up for them. I've said it, for basically since they left. You got to recreate them on the aggregate, kind of like Billy Beane says in Moneyball. You're not going to replace them directly, and that's, I should say, that's kind of the hypothesis. Who knows? You never know what could happen. Maybe someone breaks out and puts up 11.5 tackles for loss and 8 sacks like Jackson did. But I think it's more realistic to look at it this way. And then on the back end, it's different too. No Jaden Hicks, no Sam Lockett, no Shaw Smith-Wade, no Cam Lampkin. So you're breaking in 4 new starters. And granted, Stephen Hall started last year. Jamori Colson started last year because Smith-Wade got injured. But, you've got to kind of find some replacements for those 2 veteran corners. I think having Gushkin back and Nickel is huge. It provides some stability. And then, you're replacing a veteran guy in Lockett who was really good at free safety, and then a guy like Jaden Hicks who was just an absolute star. I mean, he was a difference maker at that strong safety position. So they're still working out who the safeties will be. It's kind of a mix right now. Tanner Moku, 5th-year former walk-on from Oahu, Adrian Wilson, 2nd year from Dallas, and then Tyson Durant, a transfer from Akron, who had a massive spring, was probably the team MVP in the spring. Just seemed to have a nose for the ball no matter where he was. And then at cornerback, I think it's most likely going to be Stephen Hall and Jamori Colson, but you have UNLV transfer Jeray Williams mixing in. So there's a few different options, I think, for guys here that can replace what they lost in the secondary.
Yeah, no, it should. Just when you're losing, your 2 ends and then just a bunch of key pieces in the secondary, it should. That's what I'm saying. It should just be interesting at the least to see how how it plays out. Obviously, um, it's going to be a little bit different caliber competition this year, but the Pac-12 last year also had historic levels of quarterback play, so you'd imagine it'd be a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
But closing out, kind of just the final three questions here. I know I kept it pretty slim on defense. So really, is there anything is there anything else you'd like to add about the Cougs? Could be offense, could be defense, could be culture, just anything about Washington State in general.
No, I think we really kind of covered most of the crucial pieces about the team. I think the schedule plays out really in their favor. You get Texas Tech and Washington early. You have to go to Fresno and Boise, but you get a lot of tougher games at home, or what should be tougher games. So, I think the schedule is positioned to where they could potentially win 8 or 9 if things kind of go their way.
All right, and then any other thoughts you'd like to add about the college football landscape?
Yeah, it just it's I mean, I could go on for days about it. I think it's disappointing to see what it's become. I think that we've transformed away from what was supposed to be amateur football, and it was supposed to be for student athletes, not just athletes. And I have absolutely no issue with the players cap or making money off their name, image, and likeness. I think that was originally what this was supposed to be. Unfortunately, I think that has graduated into pay for play, and I think that's what was supposed to be actively avoided. And I think you look at you know the way some other teams build their rosters, and there's supposed to be these rules here or there. There's not. I mean, Washington State has to fend off teams calling on their players all the time. I mean, every portal that opens. I mean, I know the coaches when this last portal in the spring closed were sweating it out until midnight, waiting to make sure there were no emails from compliance that player X had entered the transfer portal, and it didn't happen. And I think that's again credit to the coaches, but I think it's disappointing again that that's what this has evolved to. That the opportunity to make a little bit of money has now turned into some of these 7-figure deals that we're seeing, and the money that we're seeing getting thrown out to 17, 18-year-olds who just aren't developed enough to make these decisions themselves. And then you've got agents taking advantage of them. You've got parents taking advantage of them. And I think it's very disappointing to see. And, and I think it's disappointing that the college football that a lot of us grew up on, it's not the same. It isn't the same. You're never going to have the regional rivalries again, at least not for a while. You're not going to have these guys that come into your school and become legends because they're there for 4 years. I mean, it's just, and there will always be exceptions to the rules, right? There are still some of those regional rivalries in the Big Ten and the SEC. You're going to have that one or two guy who sticks it out for 4 years. But, I think, again, for Washington State, it's hard to look at some of the guys that have transferred out and knowing that when they go pro, it's going to be a different name. If Cam Ward gets drafted, it's going to say Cameron Ward Miami. Granted, it's not going to say Cameron Ward Incarnate Word either. So there are, multiple facets to this. But, a guy like talking basketball real quick, Miles Rice, who became a legend in 1 year at Washington State, he ends up getting drafted, getting signed. It's going to say Indiana. It's not going to say Washington State. Charlie Sledger Walker's the greatest player in Washington State women's basketball history, but she gets drafted next year, it's going to say UCLA. And I think that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow because, her in particular was someone who really changed that program. But no matter what she does, it's never going to be attached to Washington State. And I think that's why, there's a lot of appreciation for Brennan Jackson, for Shaw Smith-Wade, for Ron Stone, for Jaden Hicks. All these guys could have very easily left. I mean, they had offers, they had opportunities, and they stayed. And, when they get announced on draft day, it says Washington State next to them. The same thing, Jalen Wells just gets drafted by the Grizzlies. That says Washington State next to his name. Isaac Jones signs with Sacramento. And again, it doesn't say Idaho or Wenatchee Valley College. It says Washington State. So there are two sides of this. And Washington State certainly does benefit. You look at Deion Henley, it doesn't say Nevada. You look at Gardner Minshew, it doesn't say East Carolina. And then I think ultimately, I think realignment's just getting started. I mean, I think you'd have to be naive to think otherwise, that Florida State and Clemson are going to stay in the ACC long term. I mean, I think we are headed to these two super conferences, and it's a super Big Ten, it's a super SEC, and then, my kind of hope is then we get kind of a Power 3 per se, and that's some mix of what's left with the Big 12, the ACC, and the Pac-12, or we go away from every conference including every sport. You have your football conferences, everything else becomes regional again. So it's a long ways away from being concluded, but it certainly is. It's again not the college football that I grew up loving, and it's certainly a different world now with NIL, with realignment, and just with the greed that has come in from the TV producers and some of the school presidents.
I'm gonna try not to swear here, so all I can say is that is some real stuff, and I will keep it appropriate. And then kind of just I wanted to end this show with, and then if you want to, say a little something after. So I guess I should first off, before I go on a little rant, maybe get off task here. Thank you seriously again for coming on the show, Jamey. Everything was awesome.
Yeah, no problem.
And then my little rant. And I'll keep it light. I just want to say, as a WCU alumni, I really hope that the Cougs get 10 or more wins this year. I know that Jamey's take was probably a little more realistic with the 8 or 9. But Ken Griffey Jr., he once saved the Mariners from leaving Seattle. And even with what I said about Dickert at the top, maybe a 10, 11-win season attracts some big conferences like the ACC. Maybe Florida State and Clemson do leave. And I'm not willing to believe this is the end for WSU. If it is, I'll accept it, and I hope we kick some butt in the Pac-2, the Mountain West. But I still feel there's a lot to fight for, and I hope the Cougs show out. I hope the Coug fan base shows out, and I hope that we can get, at least 10 or 11 wins this year, because I really feel that could potentially do something. So, I guess that's my 4 cents on the issue there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And again, as a WSU alumni, I hope they win all the games and win the national title. I just, I don't think 10's unrealistic. I do think they can win 10. They'll need to absolutely play above, maybe some of their capabilities. And I think they'll have to get a game or two that they don't expect. I kind of look at those 4 games against Texas Tech, UW, Fresno, Boise State. You get 2 or 3 of those, well, then you're starting to talk 9, 10, and really doing something special. And again, I think the schedule plays out to where they could get Tech early. Again, Tech's Baron Morton still recovering. Washington's going to be breaking in an entirely new roster, and that'll be the first team they face that isn't a total cupcake. So I think there are the opportunities there, and then it's just a matter of can they take advantage.
Yep, I hear you for sure. And all right, that about does it. Seriously, thank you everyone again for watching and taking your time out this Sunday or Monday, whenever you view this. And to everyone out there, stay yourself.